The only reason I got into startups was because somebody was like, oh, that's how you can build stuff as a full-time job. And I was like, oh, build stuff as a full-time job? So we had like Mark Andreessen on our homepage. We had like Paul Graham on there, like all these people. Nobody was ever going to meet them, right? Like, but I think it kind of gave this wave. And, when we started kind of doing this, we just saw retention and all this stuff kind of like go up.
I mean, I named my podcast Next Big Wave in dedication to that. And I truly believe that we're going to get there. And I want to be a part of it, the same way you're a part of it. You're watching Next Big Wave, the podcast for founders by founders in Southeast Asia. In this episode, we're going to talk about founder journeys, growth strategies, and much more. Just to help me out, if you could like and subscribe, it would be awesome. And let's get into the episode. Well, Hsu Ken, thanks for joining us on Next Big Wave. It's been an episode in the making. I think my first ever podcast was with you, actually.
Yeah.
Probably 4 or 5 years ago, and that sort of led to this today. So I'm super excited to have you on. And yeah, it's been requested, actually. Many people have asked me not only to get investors on, but you specifically.
Oh,
and
wow.
I talk about Iterative all the time, so it made sense that eventually this would happen. And I tried to hold off as much as possible having investors on the podcast, being the fact that it's a founder for founder, but
Yep.
you have a background as a founder, and I'm sure we'll talk about that as well. So yeah, I'm super excited. Thanks for being here, sorry.
Thanks for having me. I've been watching all the stuff that you've been doing and kind of like the podcast and kind of like the programs you're running for people. And I just think it's awesome. Like we need more people kind of like with your kind of experience working on this kind of stuff and helping other people about it. So it's awesome. I'm very happy to be here. I was like, when is Tim going to get me on? So I'm happy that I finally am on.
Well, like no offense to anyone else I've had on the podcast, but for me, it's all been a warm-up exercise. I was brand new to content creation 6 months ago, and hosting a podcast was a foreign idea. And, like when you have big hitters, I want to make sure that I'm kind of ready to host them.
Well, look, I hope that I'm going to be warm up for other even bigger kind of like people than me at some point in the future. By the way, I see selfies of you on my LinkedIn feed more than like anybody. And I'm like, oh, it's Tim again. Like, I got to learn how to take selfies like Tim.
Well, I'm terrible at it. And it's not something that I was comfortable with a little while ago, but it's just a way to brand yourself. I realized that you're not the first person to say this to me, and that just means it works, like associating my face with my content is the most important thing for my brand.
My team is trying to get me to do this all the time, and I've just been like super reluctant, but they're like, you should post more selfies and videos of yourself, just like a day in the life. And I'm like, it's super uncomfortable. You know this, right? It's kind of like we're not these types of people, but
not at all.
It helps. It definitely works.
I mean, for me, it's worked tremendously. And as much as I'm an introvert in some aspects, like now I show up at networking events in Bangkok and people come up to me and say, hey, I've seen you on LinkedIn. And it's just like, okay, well, that's the icebreaker, at least if anything, it helps break the ice.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's part of what we do now, right?
It is. I mean, again, this whole journey has been just a learning experience. And for me, 6 months ago, you would have asked me what I was planning to do. I was thinking of startup ideas. I had a few products I was working on, but one thing led to another, starting to create content, building this podcast led to opportunities, and I'm just rolling with the punches or going with the opportunities. So that's where we are now.
Well, it looks like you're having kind of fun. So, that's always kind of like a reasonable measure, right?
I'm having fun. I feel like I'm giving back. I'm like a few students in my program are already getting results. So for me, that's super exciting. And yeah, let's see where it goes.
Cool.
All right. So you've watched a few episodes of this podcast. You kind of know the idea. I like to talk about founder journeys, understanding how people ended up where they are now, what makes a founder, if there is an essence to founders at all. And then I like to talk about, you're a growth hacker as well. So talk about growth hacks. We might talk about some from your previous businesses or ways you guys are scaling Iterative, because I'm sure you'll have more to talk about there. And yeah, I mean, fundraising is also a hot topic. A lot of people ask me to help them, guide them, tips and tricks. So you are probably the best person to talk to about that in Southeast Asia.
I don't know if I'm the best, but I think it's kind of like I've at least kind of been on both sides of this kind of like now, and so at least can kind of share the other side of this.
Yeah, and again, I love talking to you because you're a VC operator, and as much as I don't want to be too harsh in my content creation, I've been pretty vocal about, traditional financial VCs and what I feel about them. And on the flip side, what I feel about operator VCs like yourself. So to me, you're the type of investor I like working with. And I'm always trying to advise people who are looking at raising money to go towards operator VCs who'll understand them, who'll try to work with them, and won't give them BS financial advice.
I mean, look, you and I both, right? I've been quite outspoken and kind of critical about this. There are definitely some VC circles where I don't think I'm like well received, and so yeah. But look, at the end of the day, you and I are kind of in the boat, both for the same. We're like clearly in the side of kind of like the founders, the builders. Those are the people who are kind of like important, right? So if I piss off VCs, I can kind of live with that. If I piss off kind of like founders and I'm not kind of being productive for them, that part I'm not so comfortable with.
Yeah, I'm with you there. And so let's talk about your kind of journey, because you're now managing partner of one of the most successful accelerators in Southeast Asia, Iterative. Come on, you don't have to be humble here. You're doing an incredible job. Everyone I talk to is extremely excited about having been in the program or looking forward to being in it. But you've had quite a founder journey. If I pull up your LinkedIn, you have at least 4 or 5 founder roles.
Yeah.
So why don't you kind of take us back to your origins? How did you get started, and how did that turn into what you're doing now?
Yeah, and this is Tim, this is such a like a role reversal, because when I had you on the Iterative podcast, I feel like this was like the reverse. I was like, hey Tim, how'd you get started? So this is like a fun role reversal. Okay, for maybe people kind of are not very kind of familiar with my story. So I started our first company in 2008, and maybe if kind of like where I was in my life. I graduated college in 2006, and so we started the first company in 2008. I started that company with Brian, who is the other Iterative co-founder. So this has been a long relationship. I'm happy to talk about that. But it was my brother and then Brian and his younger brother. So 2 sets of brothers. And we were kind of young and naive. I think we were like very prototypical, just like didn't know any better, thought this was going to be fun. Honestly, didn't really believe we were going to be successful, but like it just seemed like a lot of fun. And I think we all had jobs for like about a year or a year and a half, and kind of were like, oh man, if this is the rest of my life, like like not having any fun, don't feel like I'm learning very much. And so I think startups just seemed kind of really interesting. And so I think our first company was an early machine learning company, but it didn't start out that way. We spent 2 years building kind of like, I think three dozen products that went absolutely nowhere, like absolutely nowhere. And so I know I can talk about kind of that whole thing, but I think, sometimes it's kind of like people kind of think about overnight successes and stuff, but we had 2 years in the wilderness. And so, yeah. And which part do you want me to go into? You want me to go into the wilderness?
Yeah.
Okay,
I love
great.
to hear the horror stories and things like that. So go right ahead.
I will. And look, I think it's important to kind of talk about this stuff and publicize this stuff, right? So sometimes, my name is kind of like, if people kind of talk about it, they're like, oh yeah, he sold the company to eBay and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, yeah, that's actually not as interesting a story. I mean, I can't talk about it, but it's not as interesting as the story. How it started was, I wanted to kind of do a startup, and I was trying to convince other people to do a startup with me. This is before I ever met Brian. And it's kind of the classic story. I first started with my friends, and I was like, hey, I've got friends. I started engineering in school. Other people, I have a lot of engineering friends. I think I need other engineers. And so I would go around and try to get my friends. And there's that famous kind of Jack Ma video of like, I think it's like a bunch of people that he got to his apartment, and it's like his couch and stuff. And he's like trying to pitch people. He's like, oh, we should start this company. It's going to be Alibaba. It's going to be great. And it's not that funny, but everybody in that room basically like said no, and probably all kind of regret it. But anyway, I didn't see that video until later, but that was basically me. I was like, hey friends, you should like come over and like we should talk about starting this startup. And it wasn't that hard to get people to come over, and honestly, people sounded excited. And the thing I always did was, okay, cool, let's like start working on this thing. Let's meet Saturday afternoons. Let's spend our Saturday afternoons working on this thing. Meet me at this coffee shop. And I would show up to the coffee shop, and Tim, I don't know if you've been this way. It was the highlight of my week. I like could not wait for Sunday afternoon. I was like, oh my gosh, I can finally work on this startup. This is the thing I've always wanted to do. It was like, I wanted to do this thing. I'd go to the coffee shop, and nobody showed up. After 10 minutes, I start getting some text that they're like, oh, I got to do this family thing. Doesn't have to do a family thing.
Yeah.
20 minutes go by, kind of like, oh, you know, I'm not going to be able to make it. And like, I tried this with a couple set of friends, and a couple of times I just was the only person that ever showed up to the coffee shop. Right. And I think it was really confusing to me, because it was like, I was so excited to do a startup, but it was so clear that other people didn't share the same excitement. And I kind of didn't understand. I was like, isn't this obviously kind of the like most fun thing that we could spend our time working on right now? And, you know, other people wanted to hang out with friends and stuff. So anyway, when I met Brian, as it goes, was my brother was working at a company called Zillow. So this is now they're like a publicly traded company in the U.S., one of the largest kind of real estate kind of like websites in the U.S. But Brian had actually worked with my brother at Zillow before they were launched. I think they were like 30 people, and they had become friends because they were playing Rock Band. Do you remember back in the day, Rock Band, that game? Okay, so every like startup office basically had Rock Band, which is a horrible idea because everybody plays video games, so it works. But there was a Rock Band room in the Zillow office, and apparently my brother and Brian were in there all the time. And Brian was trying to convince my brother to start a company because he was going to leave Zillow. He wanted a CTO, and so I actually to this day I don't know why Brian wanted to recruit my brother other than they were good at Rock Band, and was like, hey. Hsu Ken is the name of my brother. Hey, Hsu Ken, like, can I pitch you my startup idea? And my brother was like, yeah, come over to my house and like you can pitch it. He was like, and then he goes, oh yeah, my brother really wants to do a startup. Can he come? And Brian was like, sure, why not? And so Brian comes over with this like 100-slide pitch deck, and for an hour and a half pitches us. An hour and a half, right? And he's like, what do you guys think? We're like, kind of like the blind leading the blind a little bit. It's like he doesn't know what he's doing. My brother and I don't know what we're doing. And my response was basically like, sounds great. I kind of didn't care what the idea was. I just wanted to work on a startup. And I basically did my test. I was like, hey, Brian, let's work on Sundays on this thing. We can meet at my brother's house on Sunday afternoon. First Sunday afternoon with Brian, I show up at the house. I think we're meeting at like 1, and Brian and his brother are there already, and like headphones on, clearly are just like in the zone, kind of working.
Wired.
And I go to my brother, and I'm like, am I late? He's like, nope. And I was like, how long have they been here? They've been here for 2 hours.
Wow.
And I was like, they came 2 hours early? And he's like, yeah. I was like, why? He's like, I asked them. I was like, what did they say? My brother goes, they were excited. And honestly, did we have complementary skills? No idea. Do we have kind of similar values? No idea. Like I didn't do any of this. If anybody asked me how to pick co-founders now, I didn't do any of the things of any of the advice I gave. The only thing for me at that moment was just like, oh, these guys like want to do this like I want to do it. And so, for me at least at that moment, I was like, all right, I can work with this. Like, I don't know anything else to know, but like they showed up.
I have a question about that though, because you have now a founder matchmaking program at Iterative. It's probably super data driven and all that. What are your thoughts on this? Because like clearly like the main driver of you guys being good co-founders was a shared passion. That's about it, right? Is that not enough these days?
It's interesting. And, look, Brian and I have been co-founders for like 20 years now, right? So like,
and multiple companies.
Yeah, multiple companies, something worked, right?
Yeah.
And when I look back on it, we got lucky. Let me kind of get right out of the gate. We didn't do anything smart. It was like 2 guys who wanted to do this thing who kind of like met and then did this thing. If I think about what has made it kind of last, it's a couple of things. One is I do actually think it turns out that Brian and I have a lot of shared values. And I think that's actually the most important thing. I think people overweight like skills, and especially for young founders.
I agree.
Tim, you and I might be, I don't know if you agree with me on this, especially when you're like young founders. I'm like, you guys don't have any skills. Like, did I have skills? No. Did Brian have skills? No, we didn't have any skills. We thought we did, but like we didn't have any skills. that were relevant to kind of being a founder. Most of the skills you need to learn most of the skills that you need when you're a founder, you learn as a founder. And so I just think people kind of overweight skills a lot of times. So values to me is kind of much more important. And like a good encapsulation kind of values is kind of like, why is he doing startups? Why am I doing startups? Is he primarily driven by kind of like he wants to make a lot of money kind of in a short amount of time? Like, what is it? And we didn't know this, but at the time, I think what has helped us is Brian really was optimizing for learning and I was optimizing for learning. Like we really wanted to just like learn about this startup thing. And so there was a lot of kind of situations where it's like, I don't know, we could have optimized for like short-term money or something like that. And we just kept optimizing for learning. And we never had to kind of like discuss it that much because that's what we were both kind of wanting to do. So I think the values kind of like matters quite a lot. And then I think ego, low ego kind of ended up a lot. I think Brian and I kind of both ended up as kind of like, we're just not that ego driven. I think, look, there's kind of natural amounts sometimes in all of this kind of stuff, right? But it was never kind of like, I don't know, I'm better than you, you're better than me. I'll tell everybody right now, all of our equity splits have been like straight down the middle. We've never even discussed it. Straight down the middle, right? Even Iterative, straight down the middle, was like, we didn't even talk about it. It was just like, yeah, we're gonna do this thing, split it. That's how it goes, right? And so I think for a lot of this, it's like the stuff that actually kind of matters is kind of this personal stuff. Like, are you good at marketing or not? It's like, you're gonna learn how to get good at marketing. I'll go.
Are you good at learning? That's what matters.
That's the thing that kind of like matters quite a lot, right? But I think values is kind of the most important thing. You agree?
Yeah. Absolutely. So for me, like a few keywords, low ego, so important. I've gone through horror stories with high ego founders, and whether it's for my businesses or others, I see it as probably the most detrimental sort of trait of a founder. And then like for me, like the way I look at it, it's probably going to end up being the same, but I like people who are smart, whether it's for founders or employees. I don't really care about skills. You can learn almost anything. Like, of course, if you're a developer, you're going to do development. But like I'm saying, in general, as long as you have like the basics down, the rest, I want to see someone who is good at learning and just smart. And that applies to co-founders as well, because everything we can figure out together if we have low egos and we're just passionate about learning new stuff. If you're watching this and you're a B2B startup founder in Southeast Asia, struggling to grow your startup, we have a whole community of founders just like you. And on a weekly basis, we discuss strategies and growth hacks. We'd love to have you amongst us. Feel free to join at nextbigwave.co or find the link in the description. I'll see you there.
And I think the low ego and the learnings, that really goes together, right? To kind of like on your point here.
I think so, yeah.
Like if you're high ego, you tend to get embarrassed that you don't know something. If somebody kind of like asks this question, then you take it as a kind of a personal affront and all of that. Yeah. Brian and I were both like low ego, and we're kind of like, we don't know how to do stuff, but I'll figure this out. And we have quite high tolerance for like looking stupid.
Yep.
And again, I think that's probably a low ego kind of like thing, but we kind of just had a high tolerance for that. So it kind of like worked out quite well. Maybe one other piece, which I don't know how you test for this. I think that Brian and I also have to kind of like, I mean, definitely now, but it kind of developed quite quickly where it's like, we trusted each other. I have spent zero time and zero energy over like 20 years wondering if like Brian is working on the like with my interest in mind. Zero. Never.
Yeah. So you're right though, like luck plays a big factor. You definitely got lucky.
Yeah.
And you can kind of make your own luck. And that's why I guess you guys are trying to hack this matchmaking, and other people are trying to figure out how do we evaluate luck, or how do we minimize like or risk basically. So I think that's something that is very hard to do though. Like, how do you emulate luck?
I don't know how you kind of to me, the older I get, I think of the world more probabilistically, right? And so to me, I'm kind of like, okay, the world is not that deterministic, and so it's very probabilistic. And then the game ends up being, okay, well, how do you kind of like take certain actions or do certain things that maybe increases your chances kind of like here and there. And if somebody was looking for a co-founder now, I think there's a couple of things like tactically I would do to increase your chances of kind of like having success here. One is make yourself, can I swear on this podcast?
Do it.
Okay. make yourself as goddamn valuable as you possibly can, right? That is something you're in control of, right? So like you're not going to be able to learn everything. You're not going to learn anything from founders, but like you can learn as much as you possibly can on your own so that you are high value, right? And look, if Tim, if I was trying to convince you to start a company and stuff, and we were like talking about these things, and I was like talking about all the stuff that I kind of learned and all this work I'd put in, you're like, okay, cool. So Ken can like, A, is willing to put in the work, and B, can learn whatever it needs to go. I'm more high value than like, oh, Tim, yeah, sales not my thing. Haven't done it before. I'm just not a sales guy, right? A huge red flag, right? I mean, founders are kind of like it's just an exercise in doing things you don't know how to do. And so if right off the bat, if somebody is like, I'm not X person, I'm kind of like, okay, well, what else are you not willing to kind of do, right? So first thing is like, I would try to make yourself as valuable as possible. And I just think there's a lot of stuff you can kind of like do. Two, and this is kind of what I think about with our co-founder matching kind of platform, is just increase the surface area of the like types of people that you're meeting and who you're meeting and all of that kind of stuff. And, we've gone this long talking about co-founder matching without talking about dating, but it's kind of like a similar kind of thing, right? Where it's like, probably don't marry the first person that you kind of like meet. And so you kind of want to get surface area around kind of like, okay, cool. Who's out there? Who do I like? And you're kind of like learning about kind of like what works well for you. And so I think make yourself as valuable as possible. Try to increase kind of the surface area of kind of like who you're meeting. And then the third step to me is if you find somebody who's kind of promising, you do the dating stage where it's like you just pick some project for some set amount of time and just start working together, because you just kind of don't know until you start working together. So I don't know. That's
so it's something that takes time. So it's funny. I've talked about this on other podcasts. Actually, earlier today, I spoke on a podcast, and we were talking about the importance of fluidity between co-founders, like being able to work on each other's, like not segmenting or segregating each other's roles, but being fluid around the organization. But the other thing I talked about is how I also, before building something with my previous co-founder, Jan, we spent a year working in the same office on different projects, but we got to know each other. This was like the dating sort of phase. Yeah. And the difficulty here is that most founders are looking for a co-founder because they have an immediate project. So they don't have time to court each other for a year. Yeah. And that's a big problem. And I think people like you and I who've been able to spend time in this courting sort of phase have made our luck, because we eliminated the risk of not being compatible by being around each other. And so it's tricky, right? Because you only need a founder when you have a project, but you'll probably end up with the wrong founder because you don't have time to vet them properly.
Which is also why I think kind of like a lot of times it's really good to kind of like, if you're thinking about kind of starting a startup and stuff, it's like working at a startup, or kind of at least being in hubs where there are startup people around, because oftentimes like it's more likely that somebody who works at a startup is probably going to start a startup in the future than somebody who kind of works for like the bank. Right.
Agreed.
And so I think kind of sometimes just being in these places, especially kind of like really kind of fast growing startups with really good founders, there's going to be a lot of good people that kind of like come out of those places. And so if you're in there and you're like, oh man, I worked with this person for like 2 years on this team, they're like awesome, we like every project I work with them is great, like that's a good fertile ground to kind of hunt. I'm curious, Tim, I have an opinion on this. Do you think some people start companies with friends and some people start companies with coworkers? Do you feel like one is better than the other?
They both have pros and cons, right? But I think the coworker, you can still become friends. And by the way, like saying to go work at a fast-paced or fast-growth startup is my number one advice to anyone who wants to get into startups and they're starting a career. Go work for 2 years. You will learn so much more with practically zero risk. You'd probably learn as much as building your own product for 2 years, but you have no risk and you're getting paid for it, and learning from the best. I mean, it's unreal, the value. So definitely I'm with you on that, and I've written content about it. But yeah, I think coworker is probably best, because if it's a friend first, you have the risk of losing your friend. If it's a colleague first, you have the chance of becoming friends. So like there's more upside than downside in the coworker one.
I'm 100% with you. It's definitely coworkers every single time. And I just think the coworker relationship is kind of like an easier translation. And so like, and I think actually, I should do a study on this at some point because we've invested in so many companies and we do see kind of co-founder breakups. And I think the ones that anecdotally in my head, I think that it's more common that people who were friends before and started a company broke up than kind of coworkers. And it's also kind of the most painful because there's some founders who were part of kind of and there's founders of Iterative, they were like best friends for like 10 years and they don't talk anymore. I know for a fact they don't talk anymore, right? Wild. And it's like, oof, like, so yeah, coworkers is kind of like the best, I think.
I agree. So, I mean, look, co-founder is probably the most important thing when you're building a startup. So I'm glad we spent all this time talking about it. Let's talk about how, like, you know, we could talk a long time about all the different products you built. And one of my favorite things ever is that at the very same time in two completely separate locations, we built a very similar product with the same exact name, Weave. Do you remember that story?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Absolutely insane. Like, I mean, for me at the time, it was, I think I called it Chat Roulette for LinkedIn. And it was called Weave, like spelled, I don't remember if we had the E or not, but like, I'm always blown away when I look at that. It's just such a good reminiscence about the product and all. You took it way further than I did, obviously. But how did you transition from all these startups and being a co-founder to a VC? And I mean, it's a natural transition for people who've sold a business and want to stay in the ecosystem and stuff like that. But I want to learn about your specific sort of story.
Yeah. That's funny that you called it Chat Roulette for LinkedIn because we called it Tinder for LinkedIn.
Tinder didn't exist back then. Did it?
It just started. Just started. And so yeah, that's what we kind of called it.
Love it.
Yeah, I think there are. I'm like reacting to your it's a natural transition thing because I'm like, is it really that natural? And to be clear for kind of everybody, I never wanted to be a VC. Never. I have kind of distaste for VCs. I kind of have a distaste for myself at the moment, right? Like this was never the plan. This was not something that I like wanted to do. And like I was like builder 100 times out of 100. And frankly, the only reason I got into startups is because somebody was like, oh, that's how you can build stuff as a full-time job. And I was like, oh, build stuff as a full-time job? Like, all right, whatever that is, that's the thing I wanted to do. So I've never had an interest in being an investor. Okay. So I am an investor now and I have to kind of like make peace with this. So kind of like what happened, right? Okay. So I think this is part of part of this comes from the kind of story. So I started the first company in Seattle. I started all of my companies in the US. So the first company was, no, maybe not all, but the first one was in Seattle and the second one was in San Francisco. And so the Weave company that Tim was talking about is in San Francisco. And after those companies, I took a year off and I traveled kind of by myself for a year. And I'd always wanted to kind of move back to Southeast Asia. For people who don't know, I'm from Penang. I'm Malaysian, despite kind of my accent. I grew up in the US, and so I kind of sound like this. But I spent quite a bit of, I spent 3 months every year in Penang in Malaysia living with my grandmother. So I spent quite a bit of time in Southeast Asia, at least more than my accent gives away. And so I'd always wanted to come back. So it seemed like a pretty good time. I wanted to move away from San Francisco. And so Singapore was a good spot. And so when I moved here, I was kind of like working on kind of different ideas and talking to lots of founders. One of the things that kind of like kept coming up was it seemed to me, and this is basically the thesis for Iterative, is there's a lot of problems in Southeast Asia. And to me, where there's a lot of problems, those are fertile grounds for startups. So there's a lot of problems in Southeast Asia. And I was like, okay, there should be tons of startups and they should do super well in Southeast Asia. And it didn't seem like it was happening. And so I was like, okay, the other part of the equation then is founders. So if there's a lot of problems and there's a lot of really good founders, kind of magic happens. And so I was like, okay, certainly there are problems. So, okay, what's going on the founder side? And I was meeting all these founders in Southeast Asia and I was like, wow, these people are just as smart as anybody in San Francisco. And they're honestly probably grittier than people in San Francisco. And I was like, why doesn't this not work? Like, why is this not happening? And as I talked to them more and all of this kind of stuff, I was like, oh, this ecosystem hasn't figured out the development of founders yet, which is, Tim, kind of what you're working on. Both of us are kind of working on, but it doesn't develop kind of the raw talent of founders as good as San Francisco does. San Francisco is amazing. You like show up, you're like young, you don't know anything. It's like, cool. They plug you into like 5 different kind of places and, you know, you like get a graduate's degree in kind of like startups. And, you know, we went through YC in the second company and YC had played a big part of this in San Francisco. YC's been around, I think people forget this, been around for like 18 years or something. So it's been a long time.
Wow.
And so they played a big part. So I was like, oh, cool. Who is YC for Southeast Asia? And there was a million accelerators. There's tons of accelerators. Banks had accelerators. There's Antler. And at the time, there's EF. There's all these accelerators. And so I went and talked to the accelerators. I was like, okay, cool, great. People are working on this. Awesome. Like, this is the way to do it. And I think that and then I went and talked to a bunch of these accelerators. And Tim, this is kind of my opinion. I don't mean to kind of upset people, but I kind of found them a little lacking. And what I mean by lacking is I thought that the accelerators and a lot of these programs were run by people who had not actually started companies before, and oftentimes had not really even worked at a startup before. Mm-hmm. And to me, I just was like, that it's really hard to kind of empathize with startup founders if you haven't kind of like been a founder yourself. And the reason why is because being a founder is unlike any other kind of job. It's just so unique. Mm-hmm. And so to me, I was like, hey, the magic of YC actually is YC has this, the rule for decades now that all of the YC partners that you work with and visiting partners and stuff have started companies before. Not all of them are like billion-dollar companies and all this stuff, but they've all been there, right? Mm-hmm. And so to me, I was like, well, I don't think this is right. And more than that, I think it's irresponsible of kind of a lot of these programs, because you have these people who are kind of giving advice to young founders. The young founders are taking all of the risks. They're quitting their jobs. They're like potentially going to debt, credit card debt, funding their companies and all this. And you get some person being like, I read Lean Startup last week, and let me give you kind of advice on kind of like Lean Startup stuff, mm-hmm. right? And look, that program or a lot of these programs made no investments, nothing like that. They have no skin in the game. And so it doesn't matter whether they give good advice or not. But I think for a lot of young startups, they're like, oh, well, this program is run by this like well-known bank, so they must know what they're doing. And so I should listen to their advice. And I just thought that was ridiculous and irresponsible. And some of these programs were charging fees, and I thought that was ridiculous. And like, so I was just like, all of this just kind of like pissed me off. Mm-hmm. It's funny. This is the first thing I've started from anger. All the other ones were kind of like, this is kind of interesting. And this one was like, oh, I'm like kind of pissed. Actually. Yeah. And so it's been an interesting kind of like couple of years with anger as a primary driver. And I have this personal rule, which is I was complaining about this to a lot of people, including Brian. And I have this rule where I can only complain about something for so long. If I complain about it for too long, then I either need to like do something about it, or I need to shut up. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't shut up. And so Brian kept hearing me complain about this, and Brian was like wanting to kind of do something. He's like, hey, why don't we do something? Right. And I was like, oh, you want to work in Southeast Asia? I mean, Brian at that point was like, he was CEO, co-founder of kind of this like multi-billion-dollar startup in San Francisco and kind of all this kind of stuff. And I was like, you want to work on Southeast Asia? You're not even from here. You don't live here and stuff. He's like, yeah, I think, it sounds interesting. We should get the band back together. And so, long story short of this is like, I only ended up being an investor because I was like kind of so upset at kind of like how a lot of these other kind of like programs are running. And look, they think they're doing the right thing. That's all great. Everybody thinks they're kind of doing the right thing, no problem there. But I just had a very kind of strong kind of other view of kind of like what this should be like. And so I, thought that, this was something that was important for us to kind of like do. And so if I was going to be an investor to kind of like do this, then that was what we're going to have to kind of like do. And so that's kind of how I got into this. It was never kind of like the plan. It was just, I just was very upset that this was this was the state of play in the ecosystem. And, a good way to kind of raise maybe kind of the state of play is to kind of compete. And so, if other people agree with me, then, hopefully Iterative will kind of do well, and we'll kind of compete with everybody and make people kind of like fitter. And if they don't, then we won't do very well. Right.
So how is it doing so far though? It's been 3 years so far already.
It's been about 4 years. And we've invested in about, we've invested like, by the way, for people who don't know, Tim was part of the very, very first batch. And I don't know why Tim wanted to work with us. We didn't know what we were doing. We're like making up a program at the kind of spot. It was also COVID. And so, COVID, Tim is OG kind of like, but since then we've invested in like 130 companies. It's like 300 founders, kind of like all this stuff. and it seems like it's going well. You know, lots of kind of founders are kind of like interested in kind of the program and all of that kind of stuff. And so it seems like it's going well. We're about to, I mean, I guess I can say this. It's not like it's anything that, but we're about to raise our third fund. So we've raised about, I don't know, just maybe kind of like 85 million kind of US dollars. And we're probably going to raise kind of a third fund here, which will be, I know Brian will kill me, but larger than both of the two funds kind of like put together. And so it seems like it's going well. But you know, there's always a lot of work.
Is the 85 million fully allocated already, or are you just preemptively raising?
No, it's so the in the second fund, half of the fund is for follow-ons and half is for kind of like new investments. So most of the new investments are kind of on, and then we're kind of deploying out of the follow-on.
Good stuff. Well,
yeah,
it sounds like things are going pretty well. And I think like 4 years in, you're going to start seeing exits a lot more frequently, right? In the next foreseeable future.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully, I mean, I think the thing that, and look, most of our investors are actually kind of like outside of Southeast Asia, which I think is interesting. There's a lot of US money and kind of like Europe money and that kind of thing. And I think for a lot of your audience is probably kind of Southeast Asia. And I think a lot of people in kind of other parts of the world are interested in Southeast Asia, right? And they kind of want to be, they're interested in this region kind of like developing and kind of like doing well. And so I think they're like all kind of waiting to see like, okay, where the big companies, where the
about what you guys are building, because when we built TendoPay, so 6 years ago now, there was absolutely zero money coming from abroad. And that you guys kind of bridged that gap, which is awesome. And now I guess the momentum is sort of a lot stronger than it used to be. But yeah, that's why we found you guys and why we liked you, is because, you know, we could relate a lot more to you guys having lived in North America and worked on businesses there. I think there was that sort of connection. Negotiating with Southeast Asian investors at the time was a lot tougher. There was not the same understanding. It was the metrics they were looking at were different, and so and also the money was a lot scarcer than it is now. So I think like I wanted to kind of jump into growth a little bit, because you worked on all these different products, and you know, if time allows, we'll talk about several, but if you could kind of pinpoint the best growth hack you ever came across, what would that be?
Maybe I'll kind of give surprising ones. I think is kind of like always kind of like the interesting kind of like bit here. And so I'll give a bunch of kind of surprising stuff that we kind of like did. So look, you and I are kind of in the same boat of this. Like, look, if you really want to grow really fast and kind of like really big, it's like, you got to do all the fundamental stuff, right? It's like, okay, you got to understand your customer. Okay, what are the problems? And so you got to do all that stuff. And so I kind of say that at the beginning, because I think sometimes people kind of think it's like, oh, you can just do kind of like weird stuff kind of like forever. And it's like, look, at some point you got to like do growth kind of like the kind of fundamentals kind of like way. Weird stuff that we did though, that kind of like worked. Okay. So, the second company, it was, for everybody out there, just think Tinder for professional networking. Like, it's just, you're swiping on people, it's LinkedIn profiles and all that kind of stuff. Okay. A couple of things that worked, which I thought was really funny, is for all of these kind of like Tinder or whatever, basically there are a few people on the platform that everybody wants to meet, and then kind of like there's everybody else, right? And very early on, we kind of realized that like, if you could show kind of those kind of like high value people early on, then it increased kind of retention and kind of number of swipes and all this. So we saw this in our data. So we were like, okay, well, how do we get high value people onto the platform? And, you know, I think for Tinder and stuff, it's probably like very attractive people, but when it's like professional stuff, who is that? And what we found out was most of our users were kind of like startup founders and people in the startup ecosystem, and investors were like highly sought after. Brand name investors and famous investors even more so. So in order to get them on the platform, one of the things that we did was we fundraised. And what I mean by fundraise is, what we found out was, if we were fundraising and we would talk to these investors, they would sign up for the product because they would try it. And they would never sign up again. They would never use it again, but they did sign up. So they had an account. So we started kind of like fundraising just so we could get kind of investors kind of on the platform. And then we started putting them on our homepage and putting them like the first couple of people that you would like see on the platform. So it looked kind of very kind of like premium, right? So we had like Mark Andreessen on our homepage. Nice. We had like Paul Graham on there, like all these people. Nobody was ever going to meet them. right? Like, but I think it kind of gave this wave. And, you know, when we started kind of doing this, we just saw retention and all this stuff kind of like go up, right? And so it was kind of this like funny thing of kind of like, hey, how do we bootstrap? How do we use kind of famous people as to kind of help us kind of like get going here? So that was kind of one thing that we did. Second thing that we did was we, gosh, can I even, statutes limitations are kind of, we also found out that we started running a bunch of this analysis on who people wanted to meet. So if you were an engineer, who did you want to meet? If you were a designer, who did you want to meet? Founder, or whatever. We started kind of doing this analysis. And we basically found out that you wanted to kind of balance the population kind of a bit and who really wanted to use this. And so we found out we're like, hey, okay, founders use this the most because they're trying to hire. And we found out kind of like who we wanted to kind of add to the platform. Then we created a fake person on LinkedIn, completely fictitious, completely fake. And we basically gave them the title of Director of Membership, which was a completely fake title. And the product was invite only. And we basically had them reach out to people and be like, hey, I'm the director of membership for this like very exclusive thing. Normally people have to wait this long or whatever. But like, you know, I was like, notice your profile. And I just thought that you were like such a good fit for the like platform. Here's a sign up link that will like let you skip everything. You should sign up. Right. And I honestly thought this was never going to work because I was like, oh, we're just like LinkedIn spamming people. But there was an engineer on the team and he was like, it'll take me like 2 hours. Just let me try it. And I was like, all right, fine, whatever. Or it's a growth person or something like that. And I was like, yeah, sure, whatever. And Tim, the conversion rate on those LinkedIn messages, we got up to like 35-40% conversion to like sign up of the app. And it was
the
like
golden age of LinkedIn, eh?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, for everybody. Yeah, to your point. Yeah, this is a good idea. This is a good point. Like, this was like 10 years ago, everybody. Like 12 years ago. You
could send hundreds of connection requests a day.
And I think people didn't think about LinkedIn as like a growth strategy.
Not at all.
And so we thought it was quite clever because we were basically using a B2B sales strategy to do consumer growth, right? And it was awesome because we could turn it on and off. We were like, okay, cool. We need some growth here. Okay, turn this on. Oh, we need to add more founders. Turn this on. Okay, need designers in like Portland, cool. Use LinkedIn's kind of like thing to kind of like do that. And we just had that on for like ever. And it like totally worked and kind of like all of that kind of stuff. And so that was like really good for us kind of like for quite a long time. Can I tell you a growth story that was not related to me, but it was in somebody in the YC batch, which I just think is hilarious.
I love those.
Okay. Only in San Francisco do you have a YC company whose primary goal is to fight parking tickets. That was literally the idea. You fight
We've
parking
talked
tickets.
about this, but I love this story.
Yeah. Okay, so there was a company in YC batch, and their idea was to fight parking tickets. And they were trying to grow, and they were like, when do people need our product? Like, when is it the maximum need for the product? And it's like, well, obviously, the moment that they see they got a parking ticket, that's when they're like, I will do anything to get rid of this parking ticket. So they're like, that's interesting. Why don't we every day drive into San Francisco, find one of those like parking meter kind of like people, and then just follow them the entire day. And every time they write a parking ticket, I will staple a flyer to my startup, be like, want to fight this parking ticket? Download our app and we will fight this parking ticket for you. And they just did that for like weeks, right? And look, at some point it's not scalable and kind of all this kind of stuff, but those early kind of like, I think they got their first kind of like 1,000, 5,000 kind of like paying users kind of like that way, because they're just like stapling to this.
I love it.
And it was funny because it's like, I don't think it's technically against the law, right? I mean, they would write a ticket, he would kind of follow up, he would put it on. Like, I don't think the parking people kind of like, some of them probably weren't that happy, but like, it wasn't technically
you're allowed to put leaflets on cars, right? So
yeah,
maybe not staple it, but yeah, actually, like they could have pushed it a little further and probably talked to a lawyer before that, but they could have started printing fake tickets and attaching their fight ticket, because anyone who gets a fake ticket will see it's a fake ticket, but they might actually have tickets they want to fight. So boom, you extend your growth hack.
Oh, that's an interesting point too. Yeah, you could actually kind of create that kind of like need of it, right? Yeah, that's an interesting point.
Just like like people drop fake wallets on the ground and then you open it and then it's like an ad for something, right? Yeah. Same way, like you put a ticket, everyone's gonna pick that up for sure, and then it's like, this ain't a ticket, but we can help you fight your other tickets.
Yeah,
that's the growth hack.
That's interesting.
Then you have unlimited cars in San Francisco. You're just walking around all day.
Just walk around putting it on kind of like cars or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Or it actually could be interesting too, because you know when the tickets are going to be written, because it's like, oh, this parking is not, you can't park here at this time, so you can kind of do some of this preemptive stuff, right? Yeah. But I love that. I love that because I think it encapsulates, maybe for kind of like people, there's a couple of things that make great growth hacks to me. Like one of them is, I always think about growth as kind of, and marketing kind of in general, as kind of like reaching kind of the right people kind of at the right time, kind of with the right message, right? And I think this encapsulates like all of that. It's like, okay, well, who needs this? It's like, well, people have parking tickets. When do they need it? The moment that they get a parking ticket, right? And so it just encapsulates all of this kind of stuff. The other thing that I like about it too, which I think is more common in North America and less common in Southeast Asia, is doing stuff that is culturally frowned upon or kind of weird, but like not technically kind of illegal. And I just think there's a lot of white space to kind of like do this kind of stuff.
What do you have in mind? What are you thinking of?
Here's an example. Maybe it's not a growth thing, but YC has this famous question in their application, which is like, I don't know if it's still there. Like, tell us a time where you like hacked some non-electrical system to your kind of like benefit. You should not, and it's like you should not have broken the law, but you kind of broke some system. And what I wrote in was, did you ever watch the show Futurama?
Yeah, on and off.
Okay. Futurama is like my favorite show. And basically they came out with these little small figurines. And they were blind box figurines. So you got to buy this box and you like maybe get it. And like, and basically it's like, you got to buy a bunch of stuff to get the really rare ones. And then you get a bunch of duplicates. And I always just thought this was like, I get it from a business standpoint, but I was like, oh, this is dirty. Like you're just making people buy a bunch of stuff rather than kind of what they want. And so I didn't like it very much. So what I figured was, I bet each figurine weighs different, weighs a different weight. And so I was like, okay, cool. Let's go buy a weigh scale that's like grams to the 2 decimal points. And I went and sat in the toy store. Like there's like a big shelf, and I just sat there and I just weighed them, and I wrote all of the weights in like a notebook. And anytime it was like a weight that I felt like was like different enough, I like put it aside basically, right? And I'm trying to identify kind of this way. And that's not technically against the law, right? It's not technically against the law. I got a lot of weird looks though, right? Like the storekeeper was like, what are you doing? And I was like, oh, here's this thing I'm doing. And I was upfront about it, was whatever. He's like, oh, that's clever. And then he kind of like went into something else. And then I had a lot of like, I think just like other store people being like, this guy's weird, right? And so I think there's like a lot of kind of like areas where you can kind of like do stuff like that. You can do this kind of stuff, and like you can kind of like get quite far kind of in the early days. Maybe to kind of steal somebody else's story. Moses from Zendit. Moses is a co-founder CEO of Zendit. It's quite a large payments company in kind of Indonesia. I don't know, it's probably worth a couple billion or something like that. He was telling me the early days of what he used to do, and he used to just go to malls in Indonesia apparently and just walk up to random people at coffee shops and just being like, hey, how do you kind of like send money? Like you should try kind of doing this, which is not a growth hack really, but it was like one of those things where it was just like, he was like, I just needed to get like 10 people to use this thing so that, I could go find 10 people in kind of like a coffee shop. And so he kind of like did that. And so I think sometimes people underestimate just the like the hustle part of this, especially for kind of like very early stage kind of like startups.
Yeah, I mean, do things that don't scale is like a pretty common piece of advice for founders that, I've heard and I've given many times. It just helps you learn so much more.
Maybe if I was going to put an addendum to, if I was so bold as to put an addendum to Paul Graham's advice, it's like, do things that don't scale that are slightly embarrassing is probably kind of like a good kind of like place to kind of like go there. Because a lot of the things that don't scale that are kind of like good are probably kind of like slightly outside your comfort zone, I think.
For sure. What are you struggling with the most at Iterative right now?
It's all company building stuff to me. So Brian and I always joke. Brian and I run Iterative like a startup, and I know probably other people say this and all of this kind of stuff, and I'm often kind of like, yeah, right. And But it probably is somewhat true in our case because it's the only type of Brian and I only know how to run startups. And so like, I almost kind of think about this as like, hey, get a bunch of startup people and tell them to kind of create a VC. And this is kind of like what would have happened. Like I have a growth team. We have an entire growth team. We have kind of OKRs. We have the metric scorecard. We have metric scorecard. We have all this stuff. I don't think Iterative is an early stage startup anymore. I think it's kind of like a Series A startup. And what I mean by that is like, we kind of have a thing. It's kind of working. We need to figure out how to kind of really kind of scale it out and hit the gas and all of that kind of stuff. And so in order to do that, you got to like hire the right people. You got to get them in the right spots. You got to kind of figure out, now it's not just Hsu Ken runs around and does like a bunch of experiments and bets. It's like, okay, what is our framework for making kind of like for experiments and bets that other people can run and that kind of stuff. And so to me, I'm like very much kind of in that mode right now. And so, you know, I'm just trying to kind of like, we're just trying to construct an organization that will kind of like get us to the, like the next stage. And so I think that's kind of the biggest, that's where I'm at right now, is like trying to figure that out. I'm doing a lot of hiring, kind of like a lot of organizational stuff. And like any startup, it's like, you got to do all this stuff while continuing to grow and doing what you're kind of like doing. Right. And so personally for me, it's a lot of like, I got to figure out kind of like, okay, what are the right priorities? How do I kind of work on the right stuff? Don't get distracted by it. You know, it's like all the stuff that other founders kind of like work towards, but you know, it feels very similar to me.
Yeah, makes sense. You know, one thing that is always a question when I talk to founders is, why do you want to get funding? And B, is the VC model viable in Southeast Asia, where we're not, at least for now, going to see the type of exits we're seeing in North America, where, you know, returning the fund is based on one company going unicorn level?
Yeah. Yeah, I was telling this to a friend the other day. I was telling a friend for a venture capitalist, I spend quite a lot of time telling people to not take venture capital money. Like there's a lot of people that apply to Iterative, and you know, and by the way, founders are decide for themselves. If you want to start a a venture backed company and you want to go that direction, by all means, like it's your choice, right? But I think oftentimes, especially in Southeast Asia, sometimes people think like the only way to start kind of a company is a venture-backed company. And I'm kind of like, nah, not the case, right? Especially for there's a set of ideas that work much better not in the venture model. And I think if you actually try to work on those ideas with the venture-backed model, I think you kind of killed the idea. And so I think there's like a lot of stuff that's like this, right? So I think for kind of like everybody that's out there, like, you know, I think there's a set of companies that probably should be kind of venture backed. And then there's a lot of companies that should not be venture backed. And that's absolutely okay. And you can create pretty big businesses and own more of it at the end of the day to kind of do that. And I think that's great. So, you know, I don't really have any kind of like problem with that. The venture model in Southeast Asia, I think, is interesting. So you're right. The outcomes are kind of like not the like max outcomes don't seem to be as big, and they don't seem to be as kind of frequent. And venture is like all about the power law, and it's basically all about that. So I think one of the things that we have learned is we originally started Iterative, and we were kind of like getting most of our money is from the US. A lot of our investors are actually kind of like partners at US VC funds. So like, I mean, we have some partners from like A16, some YC partners, all this kind of stuff. And we didn't know what we were doing. So we're just asking them what to do. And they gave us the way that they run their funds, which is never sell secondaries, ride the whole thing out, like all of this kind of stuff, right? And that looked pretty good up until about 2022, when the market kind of like dropped out, right? So we offered a lot of secondaries that probably would have been kind of like a good place to kind of like take and kind of like returns, because the market was kind of hot and all of this kind of stuff. And, you know, when we talked to our LPs, which by the way, it's their money at the end of the day. So we talked to them and we're like, what should you do? And they're like, don't sell. And I think Brian and I are kind of learning now, we're like, okay, we actually have to kind of have a slightly different, maybe not a slightly different view, a different view on how to do venture capital in emerging markets that is different from somewhere like the US and like, let's say China. Europe may be kind of the same. I'm not as familiar with kind of like Europe, but maybe kind of like different. But VC in an emerging market, I think, looks different than kind of other places. Okay, so what does it kind of like look different here? You have to kind of work around this kind of like power law stuff of like, okay, I mean, I don't know how many billion dollar companies there are in the US kind of like every year, but it's like a lot, like double digits probably, like, you know, maybe kind of in the 10s and the 20s or something like that, right? Southeast Asia, Probably not double digits a year, right? And so, okay, how do we kind of like work on this, right? And by the way, for anybody who's kind of listening, and Tim, I think you're probably the same, but I'm very bullish on Southeast Asia. I think we will get there. Mm-hmm. We are not there yet. And, you know, I think that's like a pretty kind of like safe thing to kind of like say. So we'll get there. So the question is, okay, how do we operate in the environment until in an environment where we're building up to that? And I think that place is, hey, we have to kind of like, and different VCs have different models. I like our model a lot because we invest super, super early. And I think that means we have to take some money off kind of the table at kind of like some of the later rounds and some of that kind of stuff, because we're kind of getting money and kind of that. And I don't think we can kind of wait to like, you know, all these companies that are going to IPO and that kind of stuff, because look, the IPO markets here are different. So I do think it is different. Being a VC in Southeast Asia is different than kind of the US, and you have to kind of adjust your strategy for that. Our adjustment is invest very early, and then we have to kind of like look for some of these, we have to be kind of opportunistic on some of these exit points. I would love to get in the world where Southeast Asia is like, I can invest in a startup and never sell a single kind of like share of kind of their thing. But in order for Iterative to stay alive long enough to get to that point, we need to be able to kind of return money to kind of investors in the short term. And I think that's probably kind of like the adjustment we have to make. But I don't know, Tim, what do you think?
Well, a lot to unpack there, but first of all, on Southeast Asia being, you know, in the right direction, I completely agree. I mean, I named my podcast Next Big Wave in dedication to that. And I truly believe that we're going to get there. And I want to be a part of it the same way you're a part of it. I think it's super exciting. I meet a ton of great founders on a daily basis. And, you know, it's just a matter of, well, you know, the markets in terms of the consumer markets are not quite there. So the influx of cash that these companies are going to generate is not at the same level as the US and Europe. And that's the problem. And that's why the whole VC model should shift a little bit. But the quality of talent, the ideas coming out of Southeast Asia, I think eventually it's not just going to be a copying game of North American ideas coming to Asia. I think there's going to be stuff coming straight out of Asia being copied in North America. And I'm sort of starting to see that trend. So yeah, I mean, I fully align with what you're saying.
I just want to kind of like unpack the kind of like copycat thing too, because I'm 100% with you. I think there was a kind of like narrative where it was like, okay, a lot of copycat, a lot of fast follow and all of that kind of stuff. And I think that's really outdated. And so I feel like when I hear people kind of talk about that, sometimes I'm like, oh, you're not really kind of like engaged with kind of like how the ecosystem is kind of like working now. There's nothing wrong with those types of businesses. And Absolutely. I think there's a lot of opportunity kind of like in those, right? But I also don't think it's that easy. When people are like, oh, it's just a copycat, you just copy and paste. There's no such thing as copy and paste in Southeast Asia. Like there's nothing, right? Like, I mean, you worked in kind of like BNPL and that kind of stuff. BNPL in every country is like kind of unique and has unique kind of like things, and you have to adapt and all of this kind of stuff. So it's like, okay, cool. Yeah, you're doing BNPL in kind of like Thailand or whatever, right? But like, there's a lot of stuff you have to work on in order to kind of get BNPL to work in Thailand. That's different than Philippines, certainly different than like Singapore. And so I just think people are kind of like being a little kind of like, it's like, not enough kind of respect when they're the copy and pasting. It's not that easy. It's not that kind of like whatever. And so I think there's kind of like pieces of that. But to the other part of it too, I think you're right. There's like going to be a lot of businesses that get started in Southeast Asia that are unique to Southeast Asia. And that's primarily because, look, the problems are kind of unique here. And, you know, and so, you know, when you have kind of like problems that are unique to Southeast Asia or maybe kind of like other developing parts of the world, then you're going to get kind of unique solutions to that. So I think that's really kind of like important. And I think actual founders kind of understand this, right? So maybe somebody who's kind of not as familiar kind of doesn't, but I think actual founders get this.
Yeah. Completely agree. I have one last question, and you know, feel free to skip it if you're not comfortable. I want to understand if you have, you know, ever regretted investing in a startup or like seen a significant mistake in judgment in a startup's potential or your judgment.
I will absolutely answer this question. Have I regretted it? Yeah. Yes. I have regretted it like shortly after investing in the company, right? And let me unpack why, right? And like Tim, I think these are really good questions. So if you have these, you have more kind of these questions, because I think this is probably stuff that like people always want to ask investors, and they like, don't have the opportunity, whatever, or investors aren't willing to talk about it. And you know me, I'll talk about all of it. Have I ever regretted an investment where I invested in people who I thought were good and it didn't pan out? Zero. Never. Like, to me, when I invest in a startup, the only thing I expect from the founder is you gave it an honest shot. Like, you put in the work, you try to do the right stuff, and if it didn't work out, it didn't work out. I have zero problems, right? Like, and again, maybe this is something where it's kind of like if you've been a founder before, you just kind of know this. Like, it's possible to be a founder, do all of the right stuff, work as hard as you possibly can, and it doesn't work. It's very possible. It happens all the time, right? And so to me, my only kind of expectation is like, hey, if we invest in a founder, they do their best. They put in the work, and if it doesn't work out, then no problems. We're all kind of like adults here and professionals here, and so no problem there. So never regretted investment where that was the case. Like, never lost sleep over it. Never kind of regretted it. I can talk about my misses, by the way. So that's another one. Stuff that I should have invested in, I did invest in, but we can talk about that too. The stuff that I have somewhat regretted is there are some investments that we've kind of like made where I think we missed some critical part of kind of like the founder. Like, they misrepresented something, or like kind of like, I don't know, they kind of do some like shady stuff, like all of this kind of thing. Maybe unlike other VCs, we're kind of high volume investors. And so again, most VCs, they'll invest in a couple of companies a year. And so, they can do really deep diligence, and they can kind of do all this stuff. Like, we're going to invest in we invested in probably like 40, 50 companies this year and stuff. And so we just don't kind of do that as much. And so there's a lot of similar to YC. I mean, YC interviews are like 5 minutes long. We do our best to kind of get to know somebody, but we don't know everything. And so I think sometimes when we kind of, there's been times where we have actually the most painful time is we have communicated to a founder that we're going to invest in their company. And through the process of kind of like working with them or negotiating, we kind of see really bad behavior, like super bad behavior. Like, they're lying about something, they're kind of doing this stuff and whatever. And I think the things that are really kind of tough for Brian and I are like, are we people of our word, even in these situations? Like, Tim, Tim would never do this, by the way, but let's say Tim and I'm about to invest in Tim, and I say, hey, Tim, we'd like to put in $250,000, kind of like this kind of stuff or whatever, right? And we make that offer, right? We make that kind of like offer to you or whatever, and we're going negotiating back and forth. And as part of that negotiation process, or even after we agree, as part of kind of the signing and all that kind of stuff, you misrepresent something, or you kind of just like, kind of an outright kind of like, are like not a good actor, a good faith kind of actor in this. And then do we pull your offer, or do we kind of like continue to do it because that's what we said we'd done? That stuff sucks. Because there's some of these cases where I'm like, I don't want to invest in Tim anymore. I don't like Tim.
You should have the right to retract, right?
We have never done it.
You've never done it, eh?
We just eat it.
Wow.
And
has it worked out in the end, or always kind of gone south? Yeah.
No, they all gone south.
Why
Every single one of those
gone
south. Huh?
Why don't you retract? Feels like historically it's never worked. So
it's never worked. And frankly, the moment that we kind of like go through, we're like writing it off in our head. It never works. Brian and I, for better or for worse, as much as possible, we try to kind of be these people who like say that we do what we say we're going to do. And so we kind of make an offer to people. We're going to make the offer to people, right? And look, the thing that we try to do instead to kind of get out of this is, how do we vet this before we ever make an offer? That's the solve that we want, right? Yeah. But if we say we're going to do it, we're going to kind of do it. And it's goddamn painful. You know what I mean? Like transferring hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you know it, right? And look, we have never been pleasantly surprised, ever, right? Like, ever been surprised. And so those are the only times where I've kind of like regretted it. I haven't regretted any, like, company like isn't what it, like, company doesn't turn out to kind of be some like big thing. No regrets there, but that's the regret.
Fair enough. And I should say that I've spoken to founders that you've invested in after losing the first investment. So I know you're a man of your words when you say you're investing in the founder and things can happen.
Yeah. Mark Andreessen actually has this really good quote where it's like VCs make all of their money on the like 1% that work out, but they make their reputation on the 99% that doesn't work out. And I really think that's true. Right.
Yeah.
And so you have to kind of work on that. Have I
Yeah,
ever talked about the
Sorry, go ahead.
Have I ever talked about the companies that I should have invested in that I didn't?
I think you have, and
Yeah.
like I remember the stories. I want to go over them. I feel like you and I should have a 3 hour podcast, to be honest. Like I usually cap it at 1 hour. We're already
Yeah.
way over, and I still have 100 questions that I could ask you. But I think for the sake of this podcast, we should probably keep a teaser for other things to come because there will be a part two. I guarantee it. But yeah, this was like an amazing time, man, and I'm so excited we finally made it happen. And what do you think of getting Brian on the podcast? Is he a
Oh,
type of guy who would do it?
totally.
Yeah,
Especially you, Tim.
yeah,
100%. He's
I
gonna do
love
it.
it. So Ken,
Cool.
it was a pleasure to have you on the pod, and yeah, I'll be in touch soon.
Cool. Awesome, Tim. Glad to be here. Hopefully this was kind of like helpful to people. And anytime you want,
I'm
anytime
sure
you
it
want me
will.
back.